So my project will be kind of examining on the relay stations networks in Qing China. This project kind of started when I was tracing the commercial routes for one of my professors. Then I came across this large number of records of a relay station network in Qing China. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to chart these kind of relay stations spatially to see how the spatial network of relay stations kind of ties to the Qing governance. So I just want to give kind of a short history of the relay stations in China. So relay stations are really just change stations for kind of providing the food, shelter, and also horse for dispatch riders. So in a typical kind of this station, you would see a lodge for staying, and then a stable for horses, maybe some food court and then storages. And then some of the more fancy ones can even have gardens and fountains. And then so they're basically kind of spaced 30 to 40 kilometers apart so that the riders could swap different transportations to transfer to the next station. So in this way, a national network is formed to deliver messages from the capitals of the empire to messages, military logistics, and tax revenue records to the provincial districts. So they do play an important part in managing the day-to-day running of the empire. So throughout most of the Chinese history, there are usually two types of relays. So there are either the land relays, which are mainly on horsebacks, and then you have the water relays on the Yangtze and the Grand Canal to transfer informations. So in the water relays, you'll have boats, but usually horses are preferred because they're obviously faster. And then for relay stations, the priority is time rather than the transportation cost. So I think one of the kind of important things to point out here is that the relays are for official purposes only. They're not the average postal network. They are a means for the central government to have an understanding of what is going on at the provincial level, and then to transmit orders at the provincial level, so that they are directly managed by the government and are not for individual use or any use by the officials of the provincial levels. And it's a heavy crime in Chinese history to utilize the system for other purposes. So because of the importance of these stations and networks in managing the empires, all the unified Chinese empires gave special importance to the managing of the networks. They were a feature of every unified empire since the first unification in the Qing Dynasty. And they flourished and grew gradually in the Sui and Tang Dynasty, and they reached their sophistication in the Ming and Qing. So they were really a heavy burden for each dynasty. At the peak, I think in the Tang Dynasty, there was around 2,000 relay stations, and then they have 30,000 personnel running them. It was extremely costly, huge consumption of labor and money, but they still have to be maintained by each empire because they're really kind of a mode of governance that ties all the provincial districts together. So just to kind of give a scale and an anecdote, so in the Ming Dynasty, towards the end, they were really struggling with the money cost and the labor cost of the relay system. So they tried to cut the system, and then this caused a vast unemployment of the personnel running the thing and then running the system, and this caused a mass rebellion. And the leader of the rebellion happened to be a personnel working for the relay post. So the kind of subject of our interest today is the Qing Dynasty. So what is really interesting about the Qing Dynasty compared to the previous kind of dynasties that operated these relay systems is their incorporation of Mongolia, Tibet, Manchuria, and Xinjiang. So it was really the Qing Dynasty that kind of defined the modern borders of China, especially the more problematic regions that you kind of hear on the news today, that they really trace their kind of incorporation back to the Qing Dynasty. And even though the Tang Dynasty and certain previous dynasties did have control over certain parts of the frontier region, say Xinjiang, but they only had nominal controls. But in the Qing Dynasty, it was just more than just a nominal control. They did dispatch officials, and they had an active military presence in the region. So because of their vast territory, the Qing had to assemble a vast relay system for them to govern the entire country. So it was the most extensive and sophisticated in the history of Chinese history. At the peak, there was 1,795 stations forming a network radiating from Beijing, and they were essential in carrying out the Qing conquest of the frontier regions. In the Zhengao Wars, when the Qing took over Xinjiang in the 1700s, they were the venue to supply command orders, military logistics that flowed into Xinjiang to overtake the region. So my kind of project is to trace the relay routes in the Qing Dynasty to kind of get a spatial understanding of what the Qing rule was like. A lot of the stations in China proper, or like kind of here in the internal regions of China, they have kind of disappeared and morphed as they were displaced by newer forms of technologies in the 1900s. So it's been my kind of project to trace these routes. And also the other kind of guiding part of my project is this thing called New Qing history. So towards the 1980s and 1990s, there was this trend in scholarship to move away from the traditional Sino-centric views, which focuses only on Chinese regions, and then which neglect the fact that the Qing was a multi-ethnic empire that is composed by Manchurians, Mongolians, Tibetans, and obviously the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So by focusing on the frontier regions of China, we are able to get a fuller sense of how the Qing Empire actually operated on different fronts and how that was maintained. So it's also a part of my project to kind of trace the routes in the frontier region of China, which is not so well documented. So on the left, you kind of see this kind of existing data, and then west of the red line, which is roughly around 50% of Chinese land, there's not a lot of GIS data points to really trace trace the routes in these regions. So it has been part of my work over the past couple of months to fill in the blanks in these GIS data. So kind of my methodology is that I will grab kind of these sources from traditional Chinese archives and also maps, and then to digitize them to change them into a GIS format. So when you have inanimate text and maps, it is very hard to spatially visualize what is actually going on, and you can't really have this all-encompassing kind of perspective of the spatial distributions. So for the maps on the left, you kind of see here is the work of previous. It was done 20 years ago of a PhD paper that traces the routes. But what you can see there's not a lot of points on the map because of the size limit of paper maps. So when you do have a GIS formats, it is very intuitive and scalable and reusable for academias and other people to kind of explore this kind of data. So the kind of sources that I used was mainly two parts. One part was the textual source. So the main textual source that I used was the Jiaqing Huidian, which is an administrative code, a compilation of the administrative code of the Qing Dynasty during the Jiaqing era. So that was around the 1820s. The main kind of reason why I choose to record the relay routes to trace them in the 1820s was because this period was when the Qing was at the height of its landmass, and also because it was a relatively stable period and there was no kind of wars or rebellions going on. So I think it's a very good kind of starting point to trace the routes. And then I also utilized a large number of gazettes, and which are basically recordings of regional histories that kind of details what is going on at the local level, and they have kind of regional maps of the area. And also I used a lot of travelogues of officials who went to these frontier regions, so they also gave detailed kind of accounts. So on the geographic data part, I mainly used the CHGIS, which is Harvard's Historical Administrative Units database. It has been immensely helpful and has saved me a whole lot of work just trying to find the individual dots on the map. But one kind of thing that's lacking in the CHGIS database is the absence of data points, as I have mentioned before, on the frontier regions. So I also had my hands on a lot of Japanese Gaikozo maps, which were recorded and documented by the Japanese during the 1920s and 1930s. Obviously, they were not doing this for the goods of the Chinese people, because it was definitely, they were for military and these kind of purposes of invading Manchuria and Mongolia. But they have been very helpful in kind of raster image to overlay onto the maps to kind of trace the points. So my first stage of the project, I've been able to compile a database of all the kind of relay stations and documented their latitude and longitude of their hierarchical order in administrative systems, and also their present locations down to the village level. And kind of utilizing these data, I've been able to compile a map, a kind of interactive map. Here I can kind of give a show of what the thing is really kind of looks like. So this has been kind of my current ongoing kind of website that shows all the relay stations in the Qing Empire. And I think from the map, we can already have some of the preliminary observations of what is going on from a spatial perspective of the Qing Empire. So certainly, just from a spatial observation, we can kind of see here in the western part of China, there's a denser network, and also in the Sichuan region, there's also a dense network. So these two areas are really the military strategical areas of the Qing Empire. And I think it's a natural corollary for them to place more relay stations for them to better command the area. And also, I think another kind of thing that you can notice is there's lesser penetration in the southwestern area. So today we would usually think these areas as very integrated into the Chinese mainland. But we have to kind of realize that in the Qing era, it was still dominated by a lot of Chinese minorities, and the Qing penetration into these areas was very thin. And you can kind of see the maps here, how they basically just stopped at the provincial levels and are not able to go any further. Obviously, there are regional networks within each province, but by the official routes, by kind of ending at the provincial level, means that the Qing governance from the center could only be limited to the provincial capitals. And also a kind of another thing to kind of notice here is how these kind of routes, they are usually not at the city centers. They avoid all the prefecture points and also the counties. So I think there's probably two kind of explanation for this. One is obviously because of the time-sensitive natures of relays, in that they need to get the message to the next relay as fast as possible. So by avoiding urban centers, it avoids delays by going through the cities. And also the relay station was, as I've mentioned before, a kind of a device for the center to know what is going on at the provincial level. So by placing them outside of these governing centers, it's basically forming a kind of information monopoly that is independent from the hierarchical bureaucracy. So for the center to better know what is going on at the local level. And obviously there's a deviation from the commercial routes. So on the map on the right-hand side, we see a commercial route, a smuggling route that goes from Shanghai to the modern-day Xinjiang. And obviously it does not very conform to the Qing relay network, other than the part in Western China, because it was only in this part, it was a narrow geographic corridor that it has no place to go through. So this kind of reminds us that the relay stations was not a regional network, and it had other purposes that is focused on time rather than the cost, that is which is a kind of concern for commercial routes. So this has really been my kind of first direction of my project. So for the next kind of stage, I kind of want to have this kind of spatial dimension to be expanded. So right now, I mainly have the routes that goes from the center, from Beijing to the provincial areas. But in the future, I kind of want to incorporate those kind of sub-provincial level relay networks. And also in the frontier regions, because of the scarcity of data, I still have to find a lot of sources to incorporate into my map. And I think that after these two stages, I will be able to have a fuller network that I can experiment with some kind of a quantitative spatial analysis that is much better than just eyeballing the map. So I think one of the kind of advantages I have in this process is the recent publication of two books, History of Administrative Divisions in China, and also the Relay Stations in Qing, which is both books are mass compilations of historical sources, and those will save a lot of my work. And another direction that I kind of want to expand on in the future is on the temporal dimension. So what I've mapped so far is basically in the Jia-Qing era, which is around 1800s. Based on this, the current map I have, I want to push the time frame a bit forward to the 1700s in the Qianlong era. So 1764 was the year when Qianlong compiled his reign's kind of administrative codes. So 1764 was the year that Qianlong Emperor just conquered the Xinjiang region. So by comparing these kind of regions, we can kind of see how the geographic spatial distributions of the relay network kind of change, and this will probably bring us to interesting conclusions. And also, we can also push the time towards the modern days, towards the Guangxu era, which is around the 1900s. And then in the Guangxu era, you have the event of the postal network, the telegraph network, and also the rail network. So by kind of exploring how the relay stations kind of interacted with these new forms of transportation and message relay devices, I think we'll be able to kind of get another layer of understanding of how the Qing rule really manifested itself in the 1900s in the modern era. And also, I want to kind of incorporate the information and travel time into my my distribution network right now. So a lot of these sources have recorded the time that it takes to travel from one place to the other. So if we use this data to add it as an edge weight to the network, I think that will be immensely helpful in any kind of quantitative spatial analysis. And yeah, I think that's it for my project. And I really want to thank the Five College Digital Humanities and Evan and Professor Polar for giving me this opportunity. Yeah.
Hey, Tian, thanks so much. That was a wonderful presentation. We have a few questions. Start with this one. What do you consider to be the modern, quote unquote, relay stations in the People's Republic? Or do you think the degree of control over these relay stations has lost its predictive power as the technology has advanced? Question mark.
So I think what we consider because of the advent of modern technology, all those old forms of transportations have been replaced. So I think in today's the PRC, definitely the internet is obviously the most efficient way for Beijing to kind of understand what is going on at the provincial level. So I think that because we no longer have this kind of relay stations, I don't think you can really kind of tell the degree over the control over these kind of frontier regions, because of the internet, messages are reachable to every part of the country, not unlike the relay stations where it's immensely costful to place them at different areas. So the Qing Empire really had to put their effort on strategic areas.
Thanks, Tian. Another question from Hyorin is, apart from the spatial dimension, how would you research relying on the digital technologies? Sorry, I'll read that one more time. Apart from the spatial dimension, how would you research relying on the digital technologies, the temporal discussion to the development of relay stations? What continuities and changes can you identify on the use, distribution, and maintenance of relay stations in Qing Dynasty and comparatively in other dynasties?
So I think by having a temporal dimension, you can kind of see how the networks morphed throughout the eras. And I think that will kind of give a clue of the direction that the empire is heading towards in different reigns. I don't have exactly the data right now for the kind of how the distribution of the individual relay stations in the other periods. So I think once I have that, I'll be able to answer the question much better.
One last question for Tian, and the rest we can get to in the open Q&A at the end. This one is from Andy Anderson. Could the frontier regions have poorer roads requiring more time to travel and therefore need a higher density of stations?
Well, I think for most of the Qing frontiers, especially the part where I talked about in Mongolia and Xinjiang, they were rather flat. So it's relatively easy for them to travel the area compared to some of the internal provinces, which is highly mountainous and requires more travel time.